would you like to introduce Clarence?
Yes. Today's speaker is Clarence Modeste. Clarence spoke to us 2 years ago about the game of cricket as it's played in the United States. I invited me back to speak about life growing up on the island of Tobago. And he was born in Tobago, educated in Tobago, Trinidad, England, where he went to Eton College, and finally the United States. Clarence worked for Columbia Presbyterian Hospital for many years. In his early days there, many years ago, he started a school for radiography, and he was the director of that school for several years. My original plan was to have two back-to-back speakers, growing up in a British colonial country, a black man's perspective and a white man's perspective. Unfortunately, my white man was going to a family wedding in South Africa in April. Last time I heard, he was out of the country and unable to get back. I believe he is back now. Okay, that's essentially it. So Clarence, why don't you give us a little bit about life in Tobago and the colonial history of it?
Why are we seeing Vic Garber's whiteboard? Wait a second. It was unintentional. Okay, Clarence. Clarence, are you still there? Speak to us. Did he get muted again? Let's see.
He appears to be muted.
Somebody hit mute all, he would be muted. So we have to unmute the telephone numbers, the tiles with telephone numbers. Unmute, unmute. Oh, Clarence?
He's still muted.
Clarence? Clarence?
Hello?
Hello, Mary, we're going to mute you. Clarence?
Having problems, obviously.
Clarence? Clarence, can you hear us?
Say hi, Maya. This
No.
is Michael. Yeah.
No, they're having problems with Clarence.
Maybe the storm too.
If you're not Clarence, please mute. If you know how to mute. We had Clarence on the line just a few moments ago.
His tile came up.
Paul, I think it might be the telephone number 718-465-1020.
Yes.
I'm looking for it and I'm not seeing it.
Hello?
Yes,
Ah,
Clarence, yes.
great.
Can you hear me now?
We can, thank you.
I could hear you all along, but you apparently couldn't hear me.
right.
All right. All right. Are we ready to get started?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, very good. So I shall start. Good morning, all. As Michael, in his introduction, said, I'm Clarence Modeste, and I gave a talk a couple of Yeah. Hello? Are you
Yeah.
still there?
Yes,
Yeah.
we can hear you.
Okay. I keep hearing a voice telling me I'm muted and I'm unmuted. Keeps going back and forth. So you might lose me. Let me know if you lose me. So my plan today is to say something about colonialism in the Caribbean, especially British colonialism in Trinidad and Tobago. Now, Trinidad and Tobago form a two-island nation in the Southern Caribbean. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so I can carry on?
Yes,
Yeah.
and they can also see the first slide now.
Yes, of the Caribbean area.
Yes.
Good. So if everyone, I'm sure most of you are somewhat familiar, at least with the Caribbean, with Latin America, etc. Now, Trinidad and Tobago have, since 1889, formed a two-island nation at the southern end of the Caribbean, just off the coast of South America. Trinidad, the more southern of the two, is a mere 6.8 miles off the Venezuelan coast. Trinidad is the larger of the two islands and is some 4,828 square kilometers in size. Tobago, the smaller, sits 22 miles off the northeast coast of Trinidad and is only 300 square kilometers in size. These two islands lie between 10 and 13 degrees north of the equator and experience two seasons only, the dry and the rainy. Trinidad was discovered by Christopher Columbus on his third voyage in 1498 and claimed for Spain. It is said that Tobago was also sighted on this same voyage, which he named Assumption in accordance with the liturgical calendar, although no landing was made. The name Tobago is a corruption of the word tobacco, a long-stemmed ceremonial pipe used by the Amerindians. Tobago, the island on which I was born, was at the time of Columbus's claim populated by two Amerindian tribes, the peaceful Arawaks to the north, and if we can look at that map of Tobago.
It's there.
Good. So the island of Tobago on which I was born was at the time of Columbus's claim populated by two Amerindian tribes. The Arawaks, a peaceful tribe, lived in the north, and the warlike Caribs lived in the south. Both Tobago and Trinidad, located just south of the main hurricane path. Thus, unlike islands such as Grenada and Barbados and Cuba, etc., and the Bahamas, I must mention, Tobago and Trinidad experience relatively low hurricane frequency. As a result of Columbus's claim, which led to some European treaties, the stage was set for conflict in the Caribbean, and Tobago later became something of a political football. Several wars fought in Europe were simultaneously waged in the Caribbean, along with piracy, and Tobago, like Grenada, Martinique, St. Lucia, etc., shared a fluctuating fate. if you look at the map at the upper of Tobago, that is, you still have it up, I presume. Hello?
Yeah.
Yes. On the upper right-hand corner, or near, not quite the corner, there is a town called Roxborough.
Yes.
Now, just south, a little south of Roxborough and inland is the rural area of Tobago where I was born. That section of our land overlooked a section of the Murray's estate and the Atlantic Ocean. The Murrays were Scottish planters, and that section of their estate was planted with coconuts. This was rural Tobago. We lived on the land and mostly off the land. And altogether, we shared a boundary with the Murrays, although otherwise there was little interaction. There appears to have been little interest in settling Tobago by the colonizers after its discovery in 1498. The island was known to many explorers who stopped for water and wood on their way to South America. A couple of reasons are suggested for this reluctance to claim Tobago and also to colonize it. One of those reasons given was the hostility of the Caribs, and another, the fear of the climate due to the presence of the malaria mosquito and of yellow fever. The first Curlanders reported to have landed there in 1639, soon perished from the disease. Notwithstanding the foregoing, one writer records a highly positive view of the island. A very good and temperate climate, fresh rivers, very fresh fish, fruit trees, other trees for producing lumber, very very arable land, sugarcane, coconuts, oranges, lemons, tobacco, rice, cabbage, potatoes, many peas and beans, wild hogs, goats, and all kinds of fish and fowl. Colonization of Tobago by Spain began in 1511. With the issuing of a cedula by the King of Spain to wage war against and enslave and sell the Caribs of Tobago. There was one West Indian colony, if there was one West Indian colony, that presents a sadder history than Trinidad. In the first 300 years after discovery by the Spaniards, that colony was Tobago. Tobago's fate as a political football involved the change of claimant in the excess of 25 times between 1511 and 1814. The nations involved in this game were Spain, Britain, France, the Dutch, and one might add Jamaica and Trinidad. Sweden and Courland were also involved. Courland, by the way, is was a European principality in the area now known as Latvia. Thus, for a period of approximately 300 years, Tobago was either a neutral island or an island in dispute. Shortly after the British settled Tobago, the island was made a slave colony. Sugarcane was the predominating crop, and an important number of members of the British Parliament were among the absentee estate owners. These parliamentarians frequently influenced the rules governing the colony, often preventing better housing, subsistent plots of land, and acceptable sanitary conditions for their slave workers. Nor were matters helped when in 1820, a violent contagious disease proved fatal to many on the island. It was also noted by later studies that the mortality rate was high among slaves. Then in 1847, one of the rare hurricanes to strike did considerable damage to northern Trinidad and devastated Tobago. The damage was 26 persons killed, 26 sugar estates demolished, 31 sugar estate houses and 33 sugar factories damaged. 456 laborers' cottages were razed. 126 houses of all descriptions blown down in Scarborough. If you look at the southern end of the island, you will see Scarborough, which is the capital. And the entire roof of the barracks at Fort St. George, which overlooks Scarborough, the entire roof was blown away. To add to Tobago's woes, there was the collapse of the sugarcane industry. This collapse was due to two occurrences. One, Britain's decision in 1807 to stop the slave trade, and then to abolish slavery in 1834. The second of these problems for Tobago was the discovery of beet sugar. The former resulted in higher sugar prices or higher sugar production in places like Cuba, where slavery continued to produce it much more cheaply. The latter, especially in countries like Germany, the latter meaning the production of beet sugar, Germany, where beet sugar production was considerably more efficient due to the introduction of mechanical equipment. It must have been a look at this combination of woes that led Rupert Douglas Archibald of the University of the West Indies to write and name his book Tobago, Melancholy Isle. In 1493, after Columbus's successes, could you put up 4A, the map 4A? Hello?
Yes.
You're there, good.
Yeah.
The map 4A. 1493, after Columbus's successes, the Spanish monarchy received a religious title, a papal donation to the whole of the Western Hemisphere. The name Trinidad was given by Columbus upon its discovery. Columbus entered the Gulf of Paria. We're looking at the map of Trinidad. And if we look at the bottom end to the left, we should see the Gulf of Paria. We should see the something called the Serpent's Mouth, through which Columbus entered the Gulf of Paria. Then he sailed around a bit looking for an exit and eventually found one to the Caribbean Sea, which he named the Dragon's Mouth. That is on the left upper corner of Trinidad. Thus, Trinidad was made a Spanish colony. As is widely known, colonialism was carried out under various guises. Individual men, groups of men, companies, and governments were all agents through whom this process was pursued and established. A couple of examples should satisfy. The East India Company, which colonized India, was probably the best known enterprise of its kind in its day and beyond. Probably the most prominent freelancer, Captain Frederick Lugard, proved himself a most tenacious and successful imperialist as head of the Imperial British East India Company in Buganda. Both the governments of Belgium under King Leopold II and Germany under Prince Bismarck engaged their military most brutally, it must be said, to propel their colonial schemes. One may reasonably ask the question, what prompted the powers, as they were called, and others, to embark on this drive to explore, exploit, carve up, and dominate Africa during the period 1875 to 1912. Of course, colonizing was not limited to Africa. Much of Asia, the Americas, and beyond were subject to this interference by European nations. By the way, the powers referred to a specific set of nations: Britain, France, Germany, Portugal, and Spain. The answer to the question why has appeared a puzzle to some historians. There are, however, two well-known historical characters who seem neither puzzled nor reluctant at providing an answer. For David Livingstone, the three C's, commerce, civilize, and Christianize, were the unquestioned purpose of his journeys to and through Africa. Neither puzzle nor lack of clarity confronted Joseph Conrad as he, in his book Heart of Darkness, described the reasons Englishmen left their shores as adventurers and settlers. To quote him, hunters for gold or pursuers of fame, bearing the sword and often the torch, messengers of might within the land, bearing a spark from the sacred fire, the dreams of men, the seed of commonwealth, the germs of empire. And his response to the question why continues: the conquest of the earth, which means taking it away from those who have a different complexion and flatter noses than ourselves. And he concludes, it's not a pretty thing. The arrival of the Spaniards in Trinidad entailed the same clash of cultures as occurred elsewhere when Europeans encountered native populations who looked and behaved differently from they. In Trinidad, it was the European desire for surplus production and the subsistence economy of the Amerindians between Spanish settlement patterns brought over from Europe and the Amerindian villages, between the Spanish viceroy or governor of royal autocracy and the paternal rule of the cacique, between imported European diseases like smallpox and tropical diseases like malaria and yellow fever, between the mining economy based on the Spanish obsession for gold and the agricultural of the Amerindians. This clash of cultures, this conflict between two ways of life and two different philosophies of existence produced an irreconcilable contradiction within the ranks of the colonizers, between the greed for wealth and the conversion of Amerindians, between the lust for gold and the salvation of souls. This situation produced a conflict among Spaniards as to whether they should compel the Amerindians to work, without which there would be no gold and no production. Spain's conquest of Trinidad exposed this economic and intellectual conflict. On the one side were the Roman Catholic theologian Bartolomé de las Casas, supported by the international jurist Francisco de Vitoria, who openly stated that the Amerindians should be allowed to live in peace and that the purpose of the conquest was to convert them to Roman Catholicism. On the other side were the conquistadores, Francisco Pizarro and Herman Cortes, supported by another international jurist, Ginés de Sepulveda, who flatly stated that they had not gone to the Indies to preach to the natives, but to take away their gold. To get gold and not to till the soil as a peasant. This was part of the background to Spanish colonialism in Trinidad. As Spain pursued its twin goals of gold and conquests, Trinidad remained in a state of neglect for 3 centuries. July 31, 1498 to February 18, 1897, when the then governor, Chacon, surrendered to a British naval expedition. Spain proved itself not only incapable of developing Trinidad, even with its enslavement of the Amerindians and its total slave population of about 10,000, but also unable to defend it. Development of Trinidad as a colony depended on having enough slaves. Could we look at the map 5, Trinidad?
Yes, that's what we have. Oh,
Yeah, we
five.
do. Yeah, 5.
Five.
Okay,
Wait.
good. Yeah. So development of Trinidad as a colony depended on having enough slaves as well as enough white estate owners. Spain failed at both. In 1777, a French planter named Roume de Saint-Laurent from the island of Grenada visited Trinidad and made a proposal to the Trinidad governor. His proposal was to provide both whites and slaves from other French colonies in the Caribbean, such as Martinique, Guadeloupe, Dominica, St. Lucia, etc. This, he also suggested, would strengthen the hands of Spain and France against Britain. Most of us are familiar with the joining of nations against each other through many, many decades, hundreds of years of European wars. The proposal estimated the transfer of 383 white families, and that for per family, this would mean 1,532 persons. These would take with them 33,322 African slaves. The proposal was accepted, with the result that although Spain continued to reign over Trinidad, France was actually governing the island from 1783 until the British conquest. Trinidad was considered a highly valuable acquisition by Britain due mainly to its extensive fertile lands and therefore its sugar potential. But by 1997, British capitalism, I'm sorry, that date should be 1897, British capitalism had begun to realize that apart from certain special vested interests in the main center, of which was Liverpool, both the slave trade and slavery itself had served their purposes and were no longer essential to the accumulation of capital. Sugarcane planters of several of the older islands, including Jamaica, Barbados, and Antigua, voiced their opposition to the large number of African slaves it would take to till the fertile lands of Trinidad as well as Guyana. George Canning, a future Prime Minister of Britain, made the argument in the House of Parliament debate in 1802 that it would take so many imported African slaves to fully cultivate Trinidad that it must appall the feelings of every member of this House. Britain had given its first answer to what to do with Trinidad. Its population would not be constituted of Negro slaves from Africa. Trinidad had already a multinational population. The last Spanish governor of Trinidad, before he died, emphasized in 1896 the disunity in the country, the mixture of nationalities and races and colors. The population census of 1808 shows the following: 31,000 plus total, 2,476 whites, divided among British, French, Spanish, Corsicans, Germans, and others. Free people of color, overwhelmingly French, numbered 5,450. There were 21,895 slaves, 1,635 Amerindians, and 22 Chinese. The Spanish capitulation terms allowed Spanish laws to remain in place for a while. The question then before the British Parliament was what type of government for Trinidad? Voices of abolitionists and human rights were growing louder. White planters petitioned the Parliament for a form of elective government for a local legislature, such as in the old islands of Jamaica, Grenada, etc. The British Parliament was faced with a white minority making laws that not only would govern slaves, but the free coloreds who were in the majority. The British Parliament also looked at a free colored population that was divided almost equally among British, French, and Spanish. Local legislation would mean domination by non-British elements. The planters had also asked for local trial by jury. The British Parliament rejected both requests of the plantocracy and decided on a crown colony government for the island. This meant complete control of the colony by the British government. You might want to put up 9A.
All right, just a second.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, that's 6A. 6A, do you mean Jamaica?
I wanted to see the one with Guyana.
Oh, yes, okay.
Yeah.
That's it.
But this left a nagging fundamental question in search of an answer. Trinidad and Guyana, it was, by the way, the spelling here, complement of the time, was G-U-I-N-A. Today it's spelled G-U-Y-A-N-A. Trinidad and Guyana had extensive fertile lands ideal for sugarcane production and small labor populations altogether unequal to the task. No one thought or talked of anything but sugar. The registry of slaves in Trinidad in January of 1814 showed a total of 25,717, of whom 863 were domestic and 17,717 plantation slaves. While several efforts were being made to recruit labor from all parts of the world, conversations continued in Britain on the amelioration of slavery. Among considerations to increase the labor force in Trinidad were the following: attracting more white settlers, migrants from other West Indian islands, importation of Chinese laborers, importing Amerindians from South America, impressing convicts into the labor force. In 1806, 339 Chinese laborers were brought to Trinidad. The next year, 30 or 40 asked to be returned. The only country that really remained as a possible source of laborers for Trinidad and Guyana was India. On October 3, 1814, in a dispatch to the Secretary of State for the Colonies, the Governor, Sir Ralph Woodford, recommended India. The dispatch read in part, the cultivators of Hindostan, by the way, it's spelled here, Hindostan. The cultivators of Hindostan are known to be peaceful and industrious. An extensive introduction of that class of people, accustomed to live on the produce of their own labor, and totally withdrawn from African connections or feelings, would probably be the best experiment for the population of this island, where the king has the power of enacting laws and regulations he may think fit for their protection and support where the soil is grateful and probably corresponds much with that of their own. The recommendation was not that India be used to replace Africa as the source of semi-servitude on the plantations for wages, but to bring them in as small farmers cultivating their own land. British government turned aside all arguments by abolitionists and others, and not only allowed Trinidad and Guyana to recruit immigrants from India, but to do so at public expense. The result was that between 1838 and 1917, no fewer than 238,000 Indians were taken to British Guyana, 145,000 to Trinidad, and lower numbers to several other West Indian islands. Laws relating to immigration, and Indian immigration in particular, to Trinidad were amended in 1899 in a set of ordinances. The discipline and incentive to labor for the slave was the whip. The discipline and incentive to labor for the indentured worker was a fine and jail. The answer to the Trinidad labor problem had been found. The idea of a union of Trinidad and Tobago did not originate with either island. In December of 1886, a notice appeared in the gazettes of both and other newspapers of both colonies as follows. Her Majesty's government, having under their consideration the condition and prospects for the colony of Tobago, having regarded its geographic proximity to and means of communication with the colony of Trinidad, are of the opinion that it would be for the advantage of both colonies that the colony of Tobago be annexed to and form part of the colony of Trinidad. There were extensive and heated debates in both islands, with objections presented by opponents on both sides. Both islands were crown colonies whose laws, ordinances, acts, and regulations were dictated by the King or Queen of England. On October 20, 1898, an order in council was approved constituting Tobago a ward of Trinidad, thus the birth of a new country, Trinidad and Tobago. Between 1910 and the end of World War I, 3 important changes had taken place in Trinidad. First, the discovery of oil in commercial quantities in 1910. Second, the abolition of the indentured system of Indian labor. Third was the emergence of the working class movement, which led to the organization of the Trinidad Labor Party. By 1921, the Working Men's Association started advocating for constitutional reform. Qualifications for voters were $20 a month income or annual rent of $96 for membership on the legislature. And qualifications for voters were $20 a month income or annual rent of $96. For membership in the Legislative Council, it was $100 per month or capital of $2,400. The Crown's representative in Trinidad stated his reluctance for constitutional reform based on the nature of the population, what we call today multi-ethnic, multinational, and multi-religious. He could not agree to responsible local government within measurable distance of time. When the Crown's representative eventually agreed, both high property and income qualifications were set. Paying of rent of $60 per month, board and rent combined of $300, annual salary of $300. Paying of property taxes of $240 per year. The agreement led on February 1925 to Trinidad's first elections and subsequently to talk of self-government and independence. The worldwide recession, starting in 1929, followed by World War II, brought a slowing, but not a halt, to political activity in Trinidad and Tobago. The Crown Legislature had failed to make the following work in Trinidad. An industrial court elected in 1920, a trade union ordinance of 1932, a labor ordinance of 1935, a Workmen's Compensation Act of 1937. These failures led to what were called the disturbances of 1937. Constitutional reform brought with it the first small openings of human rights and allowed men like Cipriani, who was white and leader of a Labour Party, Uriah Butler, colored, leader of a working men's group, Mathura, Indian, leader of an Indian group, and Rienza, also Indian, leader of another Indian group, brought these men to agitate for higher wages, better working conditions, and better housing for workers, especially on the estates and the oil and asphalt fields. Until these 1937 disturbances, the colony employers allowed no conversations or discussions between themselves and the workers on these matters. The disturbances turned violent. One policeman was shot and another killed. The result was that the government issued an order that managers will discuss with representatives of workers concerning the workers' complaints and any unresolved differences will be submitted to a committee of the Executive Council. The workers of Trinidad and Tobago had thus made their first inroads in having their voices heard. Elections were held in 1946, and the Trinidad hero, Uriah Butler, did not win a seat. A new political figure, Dr. Patrick Solomon, a physician, had announced himself in the movement toward self-government. Solomon was a dynamic figure who was focused on a new constitution and on self-government. His speeches on a new constitution and responsible government were brilliant and convincing to many Trinidadians. For the 1956 elections, a new political party was formed with Larry Constantine and Dr. Eric Williams at its head. The new party, the People's National Movement, won the 1956 elections and forthwith began the push for independence. In the 1940s and 50s, the civil service in Port of Spain and the banks were populated with whites. Although by this time there were good schools graduating students with overseas Cambridge A-levels and O-levels, unless one was white, one did not obtain a job at the bank or at customs and excise. The sign on the building said boldly, almost dauntingly, Barclays, Dominion, Colonial, and Overseas. Often the employees came from England to fill vacant positions. And I have a postscript. The successful push for responsible government in a mixed society of white, yellow, brown, and black people in Trinidad and Tobago defies the arguments made in support of Crown Colony government. It was David Chamberlain, then a member of the British cabinet, who declared that the only form of government suitable for the colonies was Crown Colony government. Chamberlain was echoing the distinguished English intellectual professor, an intellectual and professor of modern history at Oxford, James Anthony Froude, about the Negro inferiority and defects of character. It was the Jamaican planter Edward Long who wrote a history in 1774, in which he concluded that Negroes are a different species of the same genus and equal in intellectual faculties to the orangutan. The Spanish conquest had decimated the Amerindian populations, and it was none other than the Spanish jurist Sepulveda, looking at that devastation, declared that they, the Amerindians, were closer to the monkey than to man. Also, it was the distinguished English novelist Anthony Trollope who wrote disparagingly of both the Negro and Indian character after he paid a visit to the Caribbean. Both British and other European men of great intellect engaged in this atrociously cruel practice of classifying the world's peoples according to the color of their skin and according to Conrad, the shape of their noses. Unfortunately, neither the abolition of slavery, the end of colonialism, nor the spread of Christianity has had a fully ameliorating effect on the harm that followed. I think I'm just about done. Hello? Are we there? Hello?
We're all here, yes.
Yes.
There's 101 of us.
Okay.
101.
We're
Q&A.
stunned by
Oh,
the
good.
eloquence of your talk.
Thank you.
Yeah. So, Mike, over to you. Or Mitch, maybe.
Yes, I'm prepared.
Yep. Okay, so the protocol is that if you want to ask a question, the preferred way is to raise the blue hand in the participants list. And I see one so far. Oh, and there's Clarence's picture. Clarence, your picture is now on screen. And Mike is going to be our controlling the question and answer. But actually, Mike, I'm just going to go ahead and click on the in the order they've done it. And so you just kind of referee if there's any reason to. So, okay, so let's see. Mort O'Shea.
Hi, Clarence. I enjoyed your talk very much. When you went
thank
to
you.
Eton, were you
Yeah.
one of a few black students at Eton, or what was the population of black students?
Oh,
at Eton?
one of the very few. I think there were two others from Africa at the time.
I see.
I think. Yes.
Thank you.
Sure.
Bill Tittle, did you want to ask a question?
You're muted, Bill.
Informative presentation. My question is, I'm assuming you chose to settle in the U.S. because you found prospects back home, perhaps not to your liking. But you discovered racism in the U.S. perhaps as strong as at home. But what's your reaction to that?
Racism in both countries, yes, but expressed somewhat differently. As you followed my talk, getting jobs in the civil service and at the banks was a real problem at the time in Trinidad. for people of color. And Trinidad, of course, has, I think I pointed out, a very mixed population. For many Trinidadians and many Caribbean peoples in general, coming to the U.S. meant an opportunity to better their both educational and economic situation. Personally, for myself personally, it wasn't quite so. I must admit that I had a very good job in Trinidad. I was very happy with it. I was in many ways very well off. But my move to the United States was one of simply wanting to make a change. And I had a number of friends who were living in New York at the time, who kept encouraging me to come. And so I came up once on a visit, spent a couple of months simply on holiday, and then decided that I would go back to Trinidad, spend another year or so, and then return. So that's my story on that. But the racism in living in New York, of course, was never as blatant as I think in certain other parts of the country, or even other parts of New York State. So there
Thank
we are.
you. So I'd like to ask as a follow-up. I worked in the oil industry.
Yeah.
Was the oil industry in Trinidad any more enlightened than the civil service, or were their attitudes, and this is, I think, largely Texaco and American oil companies, or were they similar in their racial biases?
The oil companies in Trinidad were under the Crown Colony system. One of the things most directly affected was trade. And nations like Spain and England determined that products from the colonies they control would be traded only by those nationals. So that the oil in Trinidad was controlled by the British and by British companies.
I see.
Yes. And the other part of the answer to that question is that the workers at the lower level were all colored, brown, black people, yellow people, and all of the managers and the managerial staff were all white.
Okay, thank you, Bill. Nolan?
Yeah. That I loved your presentation. To segue
Thank
away,
you.
I'm so glad you quoted Conrad at length. While we're cooped up, there's a tremendous movie that is based on Joseph Conrad's masterpiece. It is called Apocalypse Now. If you haven't seen it, go out of your way to see it. I'll do a very poor imitation of Marlon Brando, who gives the performance of a lifetime.
Thank you.
The horror.
All right, I'll try and remember to look it up. Yes, thank you. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Nolan. John Tomaszewski, if I could get you unmuted. There you go.
Yeah.
John?
I got a quick question for you. What's the present population of the two islands about?
Well, of course, since they're now one nation, there is a single population that's quoted, but the total population is just above 1.5 million.
Thank you.
Sure.
Haas, you're on.
Yes, Sam. Can you hear me?
I can.
Yes.
Oh, okay. Clarence, thank you very much. You know, I'm originally from India. I've been here about 50 years now.
Oh, okay.
And it sort of, you know, I recognize and empathize with some of the things you talked about. And of course, you know, I was born after the independence, but I read a lot of, I'm a history buff and read a lot of history. And one of the things, you know, I want to move fast forward. You know, the reason I came to this country, I was inspired by, I used to spend a lot of time in United States Information Library, you know, where I read Lincoln, Kennedy, those people when I was growing up. I was inspired more about the values and the thing. And in life, we all know myth is one thing, reality is a different thing. So myth versus, you know, I had a great picture of America when I came here. My myth was trashed and came into reality. And looking at today's America, in America, the racism is institutionalized. We're still going through the same things. And most of us, you know, so-called God-fearing people, we try to ignore the whole thing. And, you know, if you don't see that, like those three monkeys, you know, don't see no evil, then there is no evil, and hear no evil. That's the philosophy we live by. So anyway, the point is, it's still going on, and it depends on how you sell it to the world. You know, what your narrative is, what your message is, and the underlying thing is, I don't know if there is going to be egalitarian, equitable society in the world. I think we can narrow the gap, but we can never have absolute thing. There is always going to be ignorance. We cannot get rid of that. And ignorance is not the monopoly of poor, rich, black, white, or whatever it is. It's a common universal phenomenon. Anyway, that's my story, and I'm going to stick to that.
Thank you very much. Well, I think I agree with you. I don't think we'll ever eliminate. I don't think there is such a thing. It's a wild dream, I think. But I don't think we'll ever eliminate racism as such. These, I think, eternal hatreds between religious groups and racial groups, etc., I don't think can ever be erased from the earth. So I agree. Yes.
Thank you.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. Herb Weidel, you're up.
Yes. Could you comment on the culture of Trinidad and Tobago, the music, the local dialect, which is so delightful?
Yes.
Give us a little flavor of what life is like in Trinidad and
Tobago. Trinidad in particular, something known as is worldwide, known throughout the world now, a form of music called Calypso was developed in Trinidad. It has quite a history to it. The slaves were not allowed to do a number of things socially, especially when it meant gathering in sort of large groups to do anything. That sort of thing was discouraged. Of local Trinidad, the black Trinidadians, the of African descent, started at some point to generate their own music. And what they had available to them, especially after the start of the oil industry, were these drums. They made musical instrument out of oil drums.
The steel drum.
And the common term in Trinidad is pan, P-A-N, pan. You would like to go, let we go listen to some pan man. So you go listen to some steel band music.
Yep.
So the steel band became the best known and most attractive form of producing music. And the music produced was called Calypso. And of course, in the early days, there were problems with the whites, British in particular, because the British also ran into the problem of the drums in Africa and the war drums of a number of African tribes and that sort of thing. However, eventually, the Calypso became popular in Trinidad. It became the greatest form of music produced in Trinidad. There is something, and some of you may have heard about it, called Carnival.
Yeah.
It takes place in February each year. Trinidad, along with Brazil, have the largest carnivals in the world, largest, the most colorful, etc. Under British colonial rule, particularly during the Crown Colony days, there were restrictions placed, and which didn't exactly stifle the music, but kept it somewhat under wraps. But under self-government, which existed for a couple of decades before independence, well, let me back up a little again. Under Crown Colony, Calypso could not exercise the sort of freedom that it, in a way, was born to exercise. Under self-government, that freedom was open to the Calypsonians. So that while, let's say, in the 1860s, one could not make a Calypso where the Queen or King of England were in any way criticized or anything naughty or otherwise untoward said about them. But under Trinidad's local regulations, and especially since independence, but well before independence, the one thing you can do, the one place you cannot be arrested for saying anything naughty about the rulers is with a Calypso. You can't cuss them out in public ordinarily, but you can do so through a Calypso without any ill effects. So Calypso is the music played for 3 days, for a week or so of Carnival before the Carnival itself, and then for 3 days of starting with the children's Carnival, and then the adult Carnivals for 2 days up and down the streets of the cities and towns in Trinidad. People march and play the music, and carry on, of course, in the biggest bacchanal that you've ever seen.
Well, it is our life in the 1950s and 1960s, and brought a lot of joy to my life, for which I'm indebted to Trinidad.
Great. Yeah, good. Very nice.
Yeah, just to reminisce on the same thing, Clarence, since you talked about cricket, I used to be a great fan of Gary Sobers and some of the Caribbean countries when they played for the so-called rubber in the old days, when I was growing up in my teen years. So really had a great time at that time.
Oh, terrific. Yes, that's very good. One of the and now that you came back on, one of the things that has happened in Trinidad relative to the music is that the development of Indian music in Trinidad becoming part of the conversation lagged behind the Calypso. But today, for several decades now, the Indians are fully involved in the music in Trinidad, so that when one doesn't avoid going to an Indian-dominated town during Carnival, one can do so and still be very nicely entertained.
Yeah, see, there goes a neighborhood. When you talk about Indians, they're everywhere. There is a joke back in India, when Hillary Teng Singh, when he went up to Mount Everest, there was an Indian guy selling tea there. Before Tenzing went up there, climbed the way, Mount Everest. So it looks like, there goes the neighborhood. There are Indians everywhere.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
This is Mitch Erickson. It's 11:30. Anybody who, or election 11:35 actually. Anybody who feels they need to drop off, fine. Otherwise, we're going to continue. Joe McManany has the microphone now.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me, Mitch, and everybody
Yes.
else?
Yeah.
Clarence, great talk. My question is this. I've come across the notion that among, I think some historians and others, that when you look at the Caribbean islands, it seems that today, those that were British colonies, as well as elsewhere, seem to have turned out a bit better, politically, economically, and otherwise, better than islands and other colonies that were Dutch or French or Spanish or other countries. Do you think there's any validity in that notion? And if so, any sense of why you think that is?
Well, I do have some sense. I think that one of the sort of my own conclusions is that while the British were as bad as anyone else, well, I'm not quite sure they were quite as bad as the Belgians, but they were bad. The British also were good in a number of ways. The question of the freedom of religion, for example, while it is true that in the beginning, the British colonization included the Church of England as a religious exercise, that the doctrines of the Church of England be taught. Remember, what's his name's word? Christianized them. So British Christianity is seen through the Church of England. The French and the Spaniards.
Oh, sorry about that, Clarence. You're back.
Yes, I think I lost you for a while.
Yes.
Yes. The French and the Spaniards insisted on Catholicism and nothing but Catholicism. The British were more tolerant. The Church of England, yes, but in Trinidad in particular, other religions were allowed to practice. They were allowed to not only have churches, but to build schools. And the educational system was a joint effort between the government and private religious groups. So,
okay.
Yes.
Okay, so
I think,
go ahead, Clarence.
Yes, I think that one of the things that shows itself up is the greater flexibility we find in some aspects of British colonialism, and versus the greater rigidity in both Spanish, Dutch, and French colonialism. With one exception, the British were not amused by the idea of Englishmen marrying colonial people in colonies, the people they colonized. The French actively encouraged that.
Okay, Dick, you're on.
Oh, thank you. I want to share just some personal information with folks. And Clarence, thank you very much. I enjoyed your talk.
Not at all. It's a pleasure.
My son married a woman from Trinidad.
Good man.
So, of course, she has gotten a master's degree from the University of Maryland. And 2 or 3 of her siblings have gone through, immigrated from Trinidad to the USA, gotten degrees at the University of Maryland, and are successful people. So I thought, first of all, when she was in her freshman year, she couldn't believe how poorly her classmates in the University of Maryland were prepared, whereas her education system in Trinidad was far superior. Point number one. Point number two, when she got married, we had, of course, a big party, and all these cousins came. Most of them were from Canada, and they find that there's much less racism in Canada, and so Trinidad folks like to emigrate to Canada very much. Make that.
Yes.
And then on a third personal note, her brother Martin, his name is Martin Jack. You may know the Jack family, I don't know. He goes to Carnival for a week every year.
Not surprising. Not surprising, yes.
Well,
Mike,
comment on this. Do you want to thank Clarence for his talk?
Mike Bennett.
Yes.
Hello, Mike.
Okay, I'm on.
Good, I can hear you.
Thank you so much, Clarence, for this wonderful talk. It, I think, enlightened a lot of people on the history of the Caribbean. As you may remember from a couple of years ago, the Old Guard was formed in 1930, which of course is quite recent compared with the dates you were speaking about. At that time, it was the orchid capital of the United States. There were many, many greenhouses in Summit with growers there. And the tradition of our group is the orchid, the symbol.
Oh, very nice.
And we would give you an orchid certificate. And also, I would get to take you to lunch. But that is going to be off for a while.
We might have to wait for a while, yes.
But one day we'll get to go to lunch at one of your favorite Indian restaurants.
Well, I hope so. Yes, I certainly hope so. And hope they're still open or reopened, yes. Yes, indeed. Well, thank you.
Finally, I'd like everybody to give the Old Guard salute. Thank you, Clarence.